First of all, welcome to this great panel session. So right before lunch, so we'll keep things interesting and also engaging. So everyone, please stick around, okay? I'm gonna start with the first one, and this is gonna be more for opening remarks to everyone. When we talk about competitive balance in European football specifically, do you believe the game is becoming healthier or more unequal? I'll start with you, Graham.
That's a really interesting way of structuring the question. I would ask whether inequality is necessarily unhealthy. I think there's always a shift in the balance of power, whether that's in politics with the independent football regulator or financially and commercially with the Premier League. Yeah, I think that's almost an impossible question to answer, but if I would break it down, I would say that it's definitely becoming more unequal. The power shifted to the players in the 90s a lot, and that brought a lot more power through the clubs. And the independent football regulators bringing that power back to make it a bit more balanced, a bit more prudent. And then the next big one is the players' claims for overplaying. That would be really interesting to see how it makes it healthier, to touch on your word.
Yeah, I like that take. Graham, how about you, Roy?
I think, look, I don't think the European system is much aimed at competitive balance. If you look at the US system, that's much more the big aim, and I think that works really well there. And I would like to see that also actually being replicated in the European game more. Every now and then you hear that clubs want to take certain aspects, of course, of the American systems, such as salary caps, just to implement it over here, not with the aim of competitive balance to increase that, but more to obviously keep the cost low. It doesn't work like that, I think. But in the end of the day, I think the system is getting more unhealthy, especially on a global level, because the bigger clubs are getting bigger, and there's very little regulation around it. I mean, the regulation that the UEFA has now implemented a few years ago, again, the squad cost rule actually kind of increases, I think, the gap even more. And I don't think that in the long term that's good, because you want to see more competitiveness instead of less.
That's better. No, I think it's a super interesting question. I think what I'd go with Roy on the fact that European football has not been designed for inherent long-term competitiveness. What we've always seen is football is cyclical. You have ebbs and flows and clubs who dominate and then don't dominate. But what's changing now, for a couple of different reasons, is those cycles are becoming longer and they're becoming harder to break. And I think the two key reasons for that are, and was alluded to a little bit before, the diversity of investment coming into the game. We're seeing a greater stretch in the rich to poor divide in terms of the investors who come into game, which is stretching that competitive balance. And I think secondly, financial regulation that is coming into the game, whilst a lot of it is welcome, I don't think a lot of it accounts for the knock-on effect it has on sporting competitiveness. And I think there's too much divorcing financial regulation from sporting regulation. And that makes those cycles longer and harder to break. And it means that inherently, depending on where you stand on how competitive, as Graham said, stand on how competitive and equal things should be, the landscape is getting less and less competitive. But that does bring with it sort of its own advantages. It brings with it its own sort of knock-on effects. But also in terms of the disadvantages, as you say, the competitive landscape is such that clubs are finding it more and more difficult to be upwardly mobile. And that could have its own knock-on effects, I think, in future years.
Just a question, because I know nothing about the UK system, but the independent regulator that is being introduced in the UK, is that aimed at increasing competitive balance?
So I think this is one of the real challenges that the independent football regulator in the UK is going to have, because it is aimed at financial sustainability and financial regulation. It does not have as one of its key aims competitive balance. It's almost sort of a secondary aim. But I think that's almost an error that has been made in terms of the independent football regulator, because I think there is an inherent danger when you start trying to regulate the financial aspects of the game without taking into account the sporting aspects and the competitive balance. For example, we know that in order to be upwardly mobile, because of the inflationary nature of the transfer market and the inflationary nature of player wages and the amount of money that football clubs lose, in order to be inherently upwardly mobile, you need to be able to spend quite a lot of money. You need to often spend more than your revenue. If the independent football regulator comes in and tries to contain costs, but tries to do that without taking into account sporting balance and sporting competitiveness, what you run is the risk of cementing the football pyramid, cementing the system, so it becomes more difficult to be upwardly mobile, and that in itself becomes commercially quite challenging for the leagues, because then it becomes almost more difficult to invest if you don't think it's as easy to be upwardly mobile and move through the leagues and divisions. So I think it's going to be really, really interesting, and I think the regulator has an enormous fight on its hands to try and balance the sporting competitiveness element with the financial regulation that it's been brought in to oversee.
That's really interesting and a really good answer. I wanted to ask to the three of you, and Roy, you kind of pointed out, like, comparing to the US system on sports about salary caps, for example, how can European football in particular can learn from that and that model moving forward in terms of regulating how much they spend clubs?
Look, the rules are now basically, look, first of all, the sporting context, or at least in football in the US, is much different, because you basically have collective bargaining negotiations between the league and the players' union. In European sports, and also global, of course, you have the leagues, but also the sports federation and the unions. From my point of view, I'm obviously in law, in Europe, you can only have something like a salary cap, which is arguably the most biggest restriction in football on markets and competition, etc. If you have a collective bargaining system, collective bargaining agreement. But the sports governing bodies in Europe and also globally, they are very much used to this idea of sport and the autonomy of sports, that they can make the rules, that they can implement the rules. You've seen lately, I think, with especially decisions of the European Court of Justice, that there is an increased tendency of them, I wouldn't say intervening, but of course, but more telling them that they're doing it wrong and that it needs to be different. That hasn't really gone through yet, I think, completely, because the FIFAs and UEFAs of this world keep on making the rules without per se implementing a collective bargaining agreement. But that could be one way to make a fairer system for everyone. But I think this idea that you can just pick one element of a CBA, of the American system in terms of salary caps, and think that will work is a bit naive from clubs. Every season you hear it again, saying, okay, we need a salary cap. But why? Well, in the US it's about the redistribution of revenue and of etc. to keep everyone on a certain level. That's definitely not happening in Europe. I think especially European clubs, the biggest ones, which also have the most influence at UEFA, have an inherent interest in keeping the system as it is. So yeah, that is, I think, a main problem for European football at the moment.
Thank you. Yeah, I can see a lot of truth in that in the UK situation as well. As Aaryaman was just saying, the independent football regulator has financial sustainability as one of its stated objectives. One of its others is financial resilience, which to a degree helps with the competitive balance. It helps to prevent clubs going out of business, as the previous panel was just saying. But fundamentally, I think they've got a lot of work to do to make something like salary caps more acceptable. I think the regulators and supporters of players like the PFA, the Professional Footballers Association, need to either step up and act and provide those support structures and take leadership. Otherwise, something like the independent football regulator is going to expand its scope and apply to fill that lacuna that's being left at the moment.
Yeah, I think I fully agree with that, and I've got that working now, which is great. I fully agree with the comments that have just been made. In terms of the salary cap, we've got to remember that the salary cap was actually trialled in English football in the 4th tier in League Two in 2003, 2004, with very, very mixed success. And the reason for that is where we've seen salary caps be most successful is in the closed league systems. I think the PFA have obviously railed against salary caps, I think quite correctly, stating that the professional footballers' lifespan in terms of their playing career is so short that some of the more inflated wages you get are justifiable. That being said, obviously football has a cost control problem, but as Roy said, I think trying to pick and choose certain elements of the American system is not going to work. It's also not going to work if we try and implement salary caps within particular divisions and particular leagues without uniformly putting in some sort of regulation. So if there is a salary cap, which as I say I'm wary and I'm skeptical of, it has to come from a centralized body like UEFA. If you try and implement, as we did in England in 2003, 2004, if you try and implement a salary cap in one particular division, all you'll see are the competitive gaps between that division and the division above get bigger and bigger because there is a cap on that division, but there's no cap on the division above. And so the financial gaps get larger and larger. So I think when we talk about salary caps, we have to be very, very careful. And I think in terms of financial regulation, which is required because, as was alluded to on the previous panel and on this panel, football has a cost control problem. It's got to be a little bit more nuanced than simply saying footballers can make a maximum amount of money.
Yeah, I would just add to that, like, obviously what you have now in the UEFA sustainability regulations or the financial sustainability regulations is the 70% rule, the squad costs rule, that you can spend only 70% of your revenue on salaries and transfer fees. That in itself, in my view, is an anti-competitive measure that they have implemented, that if that would ever come to the European Court of Justice, that would not survive any test there. And that is in effect a certain in a way a salary cap already, and nothing prevents them from tomorrow say it's 60 or 50%. And the problem with that rule is that it benefits the bigger clubs because they have more revenue. So if you can only spend 70% of it, they will always be able to be spent more. Can I just pick up on that as well, Roy, because I think he's absolutely right insofar as some of these measures that are inherently anti-competitive but which sport has managed to subvert in recent years because sport has a special legal status under European law, that is now under increasing threat after the Court of Justice ruling in 2023, ESL v UEFA, which has actually narrowed the amount of sporting exemption in terms of antitrust regulations that governing bodies, for example, and also league bodies have access to. So when you're putting in these regulations, which have gone unchallenged for some period of time, we've got to be very, very careful because sport can no longer rely on that legal exemption anymore. In fact, the legal exemption sport can rely on is very, very narrow. And so what may previously have been implemented as a measure which is prima facie anti-competitive, but which is basically allowed because it's sport, is actually no longer the case. And I think that's going to be a real challenge for governing bodies and league bodies going forward.
If I can just pick up on that, thinking like an independent director, I've got to try and add some healthy challenge there and ask, do you think then that there could be a legal justification for the squad cost ratios on the basis that it provides financial resilience and sustainability? It encourages clubs to invest in the architecture, the infrastructure that boosts their revenues and makes then the increase in salary sustainable? Or do you think they should just be free to go where they want to go?
I don't think that's a justification because the clubs can do that anyway. I don't think that, look, it's different if it's from the government, coming from the government. What I very much am against is that a sports governing body unilaterally establishes those rules and says this is now proportionate and reasonable, you have to all comply with it. And look, my view is heavily influenced by the last 9 years where I worked for FIFPro, the Players Union, where obviously you're very often being faced with rules or regulations of governing bodies in which you do not have any say, which is contrary to a government's institution where you, as a citizen you can vote, and then if you don't like it, then you vote them out. In the sports governing context, as a player, you don't have that role at all, which is problematic if you have an association, because normally in an association, if you want to govern people, you also have certain rules around that who can influence that. So from my point of view, and that's also established by the European Court of Justice, is that if you want to provide for social rules, the best way to not circumvent, but be exempt of competition law, for example, is by a collective agreement. And that's the way forward, I think, for sports in the future, especially after the Super League case, the Diarra judgment, etc. But coming back to your question, I don't think that this idea in itself would be a justification. Now, it's a little bit different when it comes from the government rather than from the sports governing bodies.
I'd fully agree. So I think under the term in terms of pursuing legitimate objectives, it would have to be an exemption under TFEU 1013. That in itself has been narrowed by the ESL case, by the ISU case as well. And I think when you look at what legitimate objectives are in sport, as we've discussed, sport is it has special status because it is a predominantly win-maximizing business as opposed to a profit-maximizing business. So I think there's an inherent contradiction there where you start making legitimate objectives under TFEU 1013 the maximization of profit when sport is in fact a business which goals and aims are far, far wider than that. Which is why historically it has had special legal status.
So I want to pick on this. I want to ask you, Graham, in terms of regulation, how contrast with regulation in England, for example, with cricket and rugby. How can football learn from these other sports and what they're doing that it's good learning lessons for football moving forward?
Thank you. I think what rugby and cricket gives us in England is a lens on what regulation should look like for smaller organisations. The clubs have much less revenue, they have different ownership structures. In cricket's top tier, I think 14 or 15 of them are still member-led organisations. And there the regulator is key. It provides more than 50% of the revenue, whereas in the Premier League it's about 40%. So the dependency is much less, and I think that allows them to be more assertive. We saw in January the ECB asserted itself, the English Cricket Board, on Sussex, one of the top teams, by requiring them to present a profitable business plan. Imagine the Premier League telling a club, oh, give me a profitable business plan for the next 3 years and make sure you hit it, otherwise we're cutting your funding. It just wouldn't work, and I think that's the challenge of this legitimate objective that we might be talking about. Does that squad cost ratio provide the balance? Or is it the best way of providing that competitive balance and financial resilience? Unless, as you're saying, like FIFPro, some players' union can pull together a globally operative commercial bargaining tool that works for everyone. We saw Live Golf, they tried to do something a bit different, and it just wasn't sustainable.
With the PGA coming back on them, that's really insightful. I think in terms of I want to stick with England and also in particular Premier League, right? You have the Big Six, and how also like state-backed ownership has changed the landscape. Not only in Premier League, but also in Europe, and how also that's broadening the gap between clubs that have a lot of money versus other clubs that don't have that investment.
Well, I think this is where, and it's not just state-backed ownership, it's lucrative ownership, whether that be private equity or state-backed ownership or incredibly wealthy individuals with very strong financial backgrounds. I think the absolute key is what's under discussion at the Premier League at the moment, which is where you have that, and as I alluded to earlier, that diversity of investment, that diversity of business owner, stretching the market between the super rich and the just normal rich. I think the anchoring point is absolutely key. So currently under discussion in the Premier League is how much of the revenue made by the club who creates the least revenue in the Premier League can the top club spend? Is that a multiple of 5? Is that a multiple of 3? And I think that's absolutely key to the competitive balance point, where you take the least earning revenue, the club earning the least revenue, and you actually tie the rest of the clubs to that in order to implement a degree of competitive balance. And I think as you get more and more investment, and this investment is welcome, but you have to be cautious of the competitive balance point. I think that anchoring point is going to be absolutely crucial. We don't quite have a number yet, I don't think, of what that multiple is going to be. I think that's still under negotiation. As you can imagine, it's quite fraught. Some of the more lucrative clubs want that number to be relatively high, whereas some of the clubs who are perhaps towards the bottom of the league are looking for a slightly lower multiple. But I think it's absolutely crucial that we get some sort of deal there, because that will protect competitive balance in future years in the Premier League.
Just the gap, I mean, for example, in comparison with the Dutch league, there's always been a massive gap. There will always be a massive gap. What is worrying now that even the championship, if we're going to the second league in the second division in England, is almost the Dutch clubs cannot compete with it. That becomes a problem. Now there are ways, and I think in European football, one of the biggest, or a key element is the way that UEFA distributes the money from European tournaments, which I think they need to do differently in terms of that. There needs to be a better way to redistribute that money to clubs that do not partake in European competition, so that it doesn't happen that one club, which is, for example, we've seen it with Bodo Glimt in Norway, which is successful, and then will be dominating the league for the next few years in Norway. So I think you need to be a little bit smarter in how you distribute that money. But then, of course, you need to have the clubs that partake in that tournament on board for that, and that's going to be that's the big challenge in getting those rules changed.
Building briefly on Aaryaman's point there about the anchoring concept, my concern about that, again threading it with a theme that we've talked about in the international competitive balance, if we only apply that in the Premier League or in an English league, then we're going to reduce our competitiveness with all of the other countries. Or if we only apply it in Europe, we're going to reduce our competitive balance with Latin America. That'll have a whole series of knock-on effects on investment, player salaries, infrastructure investment. I think it's a very dangerous concept if it's not applied in a more supranational fashion.
I fully agree. I think it's a really important point. The only point I would make in mitigation of what the Premier League are trying to do is that the anchoring is taken in partnership with the other financial, the squad cost ratio financial regulation, which is setting the maximum club spend at 85% of a club's revenue. That is, of course, 15% higher than what UEFA's squad cost ratio is at 70%. So I think it's an acknowledgement of that, and an acknowledgement of the point that it could have an impact on competitive balance, at least partially, that the Premier League has set that squad cost ratio at 15% higher than what the UEFA squad cost ratio is, much to UEFA's disappointment, but the Premier League needs to look after itself.
But so in the Premier League, you have 85%, UEFA 70%. Yes. How does a club that participates in Europe then? They will never be able to do the 85% that the Premier League allows. And doesn't that cause concerns in which Man United says it's not fair that Leeds United, who doesn't play in Europe, can spend more of its revenue?
Welcome to the politics of the Premier League. Yeah, this is precisely a conversation that's ongoing between the clubs. If you take the Leeds United example, they're saying precisely this, that it's fair that everyone is capped at one particular point. And Manchester United will complain about a duplication of regulation and saying we're actually regulated in two different ways by two different competitions, and that's actually causing us a lot of difficulties and a lot of challenges. You know, this squad cost ratio is only coming in next year. We'll wait to see how the Premier League and the UEFA chat to each other, and how those different regulations can marry up. But it's definitely a conversation that's ongoing, because it's becoming increasingly problematic for clubs.
I'd love to hear Manchester United complain about duplication of regulation with the teams at the bottom of the Premier League who have a quadruplication with the sustainability financial regulations in the EFL, and then the Premier League being different, coupled with the independent football regulator. It's just becoming insanely bureaucratic, and we really need the independent football regulator to step through and help to anchor that properly.
I think that's a key point, because I think one of the key points the clubs have raised in terms of the concerns about the independent football regulator is this idea of a triopoly or a quadruplication of regulation. And the independent football regulator initially did come in and say, actually, we want to be sort of above this. We want to be the regulator, so there is only a single form of regulation, and that will make things easier for clubs. Unfortunately, I think what we've seen in the early stages of the regulator's conception is that they've not quite followed through in that promise, and there is a lot of overlap, and they haven't quite managed to do that. If we take the owners, directors, and senior executives test as an example, so this is the independent football regulator's new variation of the fit and proper persons tests that assesses new owners. So they're going to implement that, but also the leagues are going to continue to implement their own owners and directors tests. So suddenly any new owner or director has to go through two different tests. So if you're appointing a new director at your football club, actually, football is a dynamic business, and maybe you want to get that done in a couple of weeks. It's going to take a lot longer, and it's going to be a lot more stringent. And you've got to remember, a lot of these clubs, particularly below the Premier League, are small to medium-sized businesses. They don't have the resources to be able to contend. A lot of them don't even have internal counsel. They don't have the resources to be able to contend with that, and I think that's going to be a real challenge going forward.
In terms of the, I want to just touch on Super League case and how that changed the landscape. I know, Roy, you mentioned a little bit about it, but in particular with the biggest clubs in Europe, right? But how that attempt has changed the mindset of the clubs from the high to lower cap clubs.
I don't think that much changed, actually, to be honest, because everything is back to how it was, right? I mean, we had the clubs announcing it, and then it's, let there be no mistake, the only reason why that plan didn't succeed was because of the fans. That was the reason why they ultimately didn't go through. Then all those clubs were out of the ECA, and now they're all back in the ECA, which is rebranded as the EFC now, of course. Or maybe not all of them, but I think maybe one or two exceptions. But most of them are back, and they are a happy family with UEFA again, and making new rules around to the Champions League and the Europa leagues, etc. So I don't look. Obviously, from a legal point of view, it's changed a lot, because that case that then was brought to the European Court of Justice by the courts in Madrid, yeah, that has a lot of consequences for UEFA in terms of changing their rules, and it will be very interesting to see if, and I think it's almost, I think, unimaginable that it will not happen at some point again. What will happen if a new competitor comes in, or a new entity say, okay, we're going to start it again? And I don't think that is an unrealistic thing to expect. But yeah, I don't think that right now, from the football family, so much has changed, but it has had a lot of implications from a legal point of view. Yeah.
I'd fully agree with that. I think the biggest change has been a legal one, particularly in the aftermath of the European Court case in 2023. What that's done, as I alluded to earlier, is narrow the competitive and antitrust sporting exemption that governing bodies have. In effect, what that means is governing bodies find it increasingly difficult to act as both a regulator and a competition organizer, which they are. In effect, what that means is it lowers the barriers to entry for new market participants, whether that be a competition organizer or a new new regulator. And I think, organizations like UEFA are going to have to be very, very mindful of that when they're designing new competition, or, or managing current competitions, or are structuring themselves to allow or deny new market participants. I think that's going to be a real crucial change going forward. And as Roy says, it's not unforeseeable that we get new market participants over the next few years as a result.
Yeah, and picking up on the fact, or the likelihood that it's going to rear its head again, I think the Super League is a development of a concept that we had between, say, when I was a young player in Scotland, Scottish clubs and Dutch clubs and Scandinavians of the North Atlantic League back in the 90s and 2000s. It's going to find its way if it has a purpose. But I think what that movement caused, as Roy also said, is that fans stepped up, protected the clubs, and it showed the clubs that the community is key, and the clubs can't move forward without the community. Governments, therefore, also in England, have stepped in to ensure that that connection remains. And I'm really excited to see how that regulation develops in England, the world's first football regulator, and hopefully across Europe in its own way.
Should point out as well that the football regulator in England is part of a wider trend towards financial regulation across some of the major European football economies. So obviously the football regulator, because it's so new and because it's in the English market, is the in vogue thing at the moment. But we can't forget we've got a sports regulator in Italy now that covers football. We've got a financial regulator in France that looks specifically at football clubs. I think what's happened over the last few years is a lot of those major European football economies have identified some of the governance issues that have arisen out of the changing landscape of European football, and their answer has been either, as it was in France, the league body, or as it was in Italy and England, the governments have turned to regulation as an answer, with mixed results. But like I say, we'll see where this regulator in England goes.
That's really interesting. I also, touching on Super League, and then, 2 years later, right? Last year we have the FIFA Club World Cup, right? And that really benefited the big clubs. Thinking from a sports journalistic perspective, and being the US, and how also there was more money pouring into the big clubs at the end of the day. So I think that also widened the gap even a bit more. That you guys were touching up on that. So do you see any potential, fix on that, or like for smaller players in the pond, that they can actually benefit from this new model of competitions that want to, get the European clubs, especially out there in the US, and they're already talking about doing another FIFA Club World Cup in a couple of years, right?
Look, I think FIFA looked at the UEFA and thought we can do that as well, and that's very interesting, of course, from a commercial point of view and money-wise. And yeah, it's also very easy to look at that from a European point of view. So it's a bit of nonsense, because do the fans of Man City really care about this tournament? On the other hand, if you look at the fans of Al Ahly from Egypt, they very much enjoy that tournament. So there's something to say from all sides. I think but the problem that you point out as well is that it brings a lot of money to one or two clubs from a domestic league, and that might screw up the dynamics in that league. And you have to be very careful with that, because then that league becomes very uninteresting if for 10, 20 years in a row that team wins the league all the time. And I think from the World League Association, which is also a big player on the international level, that was one of their biggest concerns about that tournament. But that we should not be too European about everything, that's also true, right? I mean, there's more than just European football. And I think to see those teams as Al Ahly or Auckland, that's actually quite nice to see as well.
I think there's been a lot of discussion, perhaps excessive discussion, about the execution of the Club World Cup last year, which had its challenges. If we just put that to one side for a moment, because it's a new competition, and new competitions always have challenges of execution and operation. As Roy says, it's a competition that had perfect economic sense for FIFA from the money they generated from it, and also cultural sense insofar as the value it has to non-European clubs. I think the The challenge really is the match calendar in terms of how that is getting increasingly congested. And I think that's the one real argument that you could have against the Club World Cup. Having said that, I don't think it's an infallible argument, because the way of circumventing that is actually for these regulatory bodies, these governing bodies, to talk to each other. One of the key challenges we've got in football, whether that be on a national level or on a more international scale, is the fragmentation of regulation, and lots of different regulators were moving in lots of different directors. Actually, if these governing bodies tried to get into a room with FIFA Pro or get into a room with UEFA and sort out what the match calendar is going to be, actually that key challenge, which I think a lot of people were nervous about around the Club World Cup, could be overcome. And that fragmentation of regulation is something more widely that we've really got to look at, because it's an extremely challenging environment to operate in.
No, just saying, look, what Aaryaman said about the international match calendar. That is the hottest topic, I think, of all. Which there are lawsuits pending already in the Belgian courts around that. The French Players Union just had a complaint found admissible at the European Social Charter against the government of France. For not protecting players' health enough in terms of the match calendar. So that definitely is going to be one of the biggest challenges that the sports governing bodies have coming their way in the upcoming years, if they don't find an agreement on that now.
Yeah, this is such an interesting chat. Time is running out, so I would love to keep talking, but I know you guys probably want to head to lunch. But I want to ask you one last question to each one of you, and from your own perspective. What's one reform that European football cannot avoid in the next few years that you would like to see? Graham, from your perspective, you gave a really good contrast from other sports, right? In England, like rugby and cricket. What's one reform that you want to see from European football in the coming years?
I think it's probably independence. I think if clubs can add more of their own internal independent oversight with independent non-executive directors, which in England the Football Association has been overhauling all of its boards, one of which I'm on, to ensure that independent non-executive directors have a significant influence, more than 25%, hold key positions, and in this way you can integrate into the decisions of the organization at a strategic level, challenge, healthy sense checking, soundboarding, so that you prevent the problems of the future when they're just issues that are intellectually handled in the board. I think that's the reform that if football bodies, whether it's clubs, governing bodies, agencies, if they don't add that into their own self-regulation, then they're going to get regulated upon by something like the independent football regulator.
I think from an international level, it is the way that the rules are being made. You need to have it more inclusive. I don't say that FIFA has to make collective bargaining agreements, but you need to make something which closely resembles that. The agents are suing them, the fans have filed complaints, player unions are suing them, and also players individually through the Justice for Players lawsuit are suing them. So, and we've seen now in the last 2-3 years an enormous increase already of legal cases. That's going to continue if they don't find a solution for the way in which the rules are being created and implemented.
I think I'll just keep it brief and pick up off my previous answer, which is unification. Too much fragmented regulation makes it very, very challenging for football clubs and for wider stakeholders, whether that's the independent football regulator in England trying to unify some of the financial regulations across the board, or whether that's FIFA, UEFA, FIFA Pro working in greater tandem with each other. I think that's the absolute key to helping streamline some of the challenges that we've currently got in football.
Thank you, gentlemen. Aaryaman, Roy, Graham, thank you. A big round of applause for our panelists for this great session. Thank you so much. So now it's time for lunch, guys. So we'll meet back here in an hour. So thank you for attending and enjoy the food.